Russia accused the United States of imposing a de facto naval quarantine on Venezuelan oil and compared it to piracy, according to the Russian Foreign Ministry. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova delivered a sharp rebuke of Washington's actions during a press briefing. Zakharova said, "Today we are witnessing lawlessness in the Caribbean Sea, where long-forgotten theft of other people's property, namely piracy, raiding, and banditry, are being revived." The language is striking. By invoking piracy and banditry, Moscow is framing the U.S. actions not as legitimate law enforcement, but as criminal acts that violate international norms. Russia on Monday expressed full support for Venezuela as the South American country confronts what Caracas and Moscow describe as a blockade of sanctioned oil tankers by U.S. forces deployed in the Caribbean, according to both governments. Washington frames it as a quarantine and sanctions enforcement. Reports say the U.S. has increased its naval presence and has intercepted vessels. Caracas and Moscow describe it as a blockade, while Washington frames it as a quarantine and sanctions control. The messaging also fits Moscow's line, presenting itself as a defender of sovereignty against U.S. pressure, according to its own foreign ministry. Zakharova said Russia advocates for de-escalation and called for diplomatic solutions while criticizing the U.S. for its maritime operation. She said, "We consistently advocate for a de-escalation, maintenance of trusting relationship, and predictability. It is important not to let events develop in a destructive way." For Moscow, the situation in the Caribbean represents another example of what it views as American unilateralism, acting outside international legal frameworks to impose its will on smaller nations. In a notable diplomatic gesture, Zakharova expressed hope that President Trump would find a path toward de-escalation. She said, "We hope that the pragmatism and rationality of U.S. President Trump will allow solutions to be found that are mutually acceptable to the parties within the framework of international legal norms." The framing is significant. By praising Trump's pragmatism and rationality, Moscow appears to be leaving the door open for diplomatic engagement, suggesting that the problem lies not with Trump personally, but with the policies being pursued. This approach contrasts with the harsher rhetoric Russia has directed at other U.S. administrations and may reflect Moscow's calculation that Trump is more open to transactional diplomacy than his predecessors. Moscow reaffirmed its support for Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his government. Zakharova said, "We confirm our support for the efforts of the government of Nicolás Maduro aimed at protecting sovereignty and national interests and maintaining the stable and secure development of his country." Russia and Venezuela have maintained close ties for years, with Moscow providing political backing and economic support to Caracas in the face of U.S. sanctions and pressure. For Russia, supporting Venezuela serves multiple purposes. It challenges U.S. influence in Latin America, demonstrates that Washington cannot isolate governments it opposes, and maintains a foothold in a region the United States has traditionally considered its sphere of influence. The relationship between Russia and Venezuela has deepened considerably over the past 2 decades. Moscow has provided Caracas with weapons, loans, and political support, investments that have paid dividends as Venezuela has become one of Russia's most reliable partners in the Western Hemisphere. For the Maduro government, Russian backing provides a crucial lifeline against U.S. pressure. For Russia, Venezuela offers both a strategic foothold in the Americas and a demonstration that countries can resist American sanctions if they have powerful allies. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Venezuelan Foreign Minister Ivan Gil held a phone call to discuss the escalating situation. According to the Russian Foreign Ministry, the ministers expressed their deep concern over the escalation of Washington's actions in the Caribbean Sea, which could have serious consequences for the region and threaten international shipping. The statement added, "The Russian side reaffirmed its full support for and solidarity with the Venezuelan leadership and people in the current context." The phone call signals the close coordination between Moscow and Caracas as both governments seek to build international opposition to U.S. actions. The two foreign ministers agreed to continue working together on the international stage. According to the Russian Foreign Ministry, the ministers agreed to continue their close bilateral cooperation and to coordinate their actions on the international stage, particularly at the UN, in order to ensure respect for state sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs. The reference to non-interference in internal affairs is a principle that both Russia and China have championed in international forums, and one they argue the United States routinely violates. By framing their opposition in these terms, Moscow and Caracas are appealing to a broader coalition of countries that share concerns about American interventionism. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Ivan Gil used even stronger language to describe U.S. actions. On Telegram, Gil said he and Lavrov had discussed the aggressions and flagrant violations of international law being perpetrated in the Caribbean, attacks on vessels, extrajudicial executions, and illicit acts of piracy carried out by the United States government. Caracas spoke of extrajudicial executions and families, and allied governments reported more than 100 deaths. UN experts have criticized the use of lethal force in attacks on vessels, according to OHCHR reporting. Gil said Lavrov had affirmed Moscow's full support in the face of hostilities against our country. An urgent session or briefing was convened at the UN on this issue, according to Security Council tracking. The meeting was requested by Caracas and is backed by China and Russia. The Security Council session represents an effort by Venezuela and its allies to internationalize the dispute, bringing it before the world's premier forum for addressing threats to international peace and security. However, as a permanent member of the Security Council with veto power, the United States can block any resolution it opposes. The meeting is therefore likely to be more about making a political statement than achieving concrete action. The decision to bring the matter to the UN Security Council reflects a calculated strategy by Venezuela and its allies. While they know the United States will block any binding resolution, the meeting serves other purposes. It forces a public debate on American actions, creates a platform for criticism of U.S. policy, and allows countries sympathetic to Venezuela to voice their concerns on the global stage. For Russia and China, it is also an opportunity to highlight what they characterize as American hypocrisy, a superpower that lectures others about international law while allegedly violating it in its own hemisphere. Trump announced a quarantine or interdiction of sanctioned vessels linked to Venezuelan oil. Reports indicate the U.S. has already intercepted 2 tankers and was preparing a third. U.S. forces have since September launched strikes on boats Washington says were trafficking drugs in the Caribbean Sea and eastern Pacific Ocean. Washington maintains they were drug trafficking routes. Reports indicate the U.S. has not published detailed evidence for each target, according to Reuters. Caracas spoke of extrajudicial executions and families, and allied governments reported more than 100 deaths. UN experts have criticized the use of lethal force in attacks on vessels, according to OHCHR. Some of those killed were fishermen, according to their families, raising questions about targeting. And the episode has escalated regional tensions and has already reached debate at the UN, with competing versions between Washington and Caracas, according to Reuters. President Trump has justified the interdiction by claiming that Venezuela under Maduro is using oil money to finance criminal activity. Trump has claimed Caracas under Maduro is using oil money to finance drug terrorism, human trafficking, murder, and kidnapping. Venezuela and its allies reject these characterizations, arguing that the U.S. is using unsubstantiated allegations to justify what amounts to economic warfare against a sovereign nation. The dispute reflects fundamentally different views of the situation. Washington sees a criminal regime that must be pressured into submission, while Caracas and its allies see a legitimate government under illegal attack. In separate comments, Zakharova addressed the ongoing negotiations between Russia and the United States over the conflict in Ukraine. Zakharova said in the negotiation process with the United States, there is slow but steady progress. The characterization suggests that despite the tensions over Venezuela and other issues, Moscow and Washington continue to engage on what Russia considers the most important diplomatic track. The acknowledgement of progress, even if slow, represents a notable statement given the deep mistrust between the two countries. However, Zakharova accused Western European countries of attempting to undermine the negotiations. She said the progress is accompanied, as it has already been repeatedly said, by highly harmful and even malicious attempts by a group of countries, primarily Western European ones, to torpedo these efforts and derail the whole diplomatic progress that has been achieved. The accusation reflects Russia's long-standing complaint that European governments, particularly the UK, France, and Germany, are pushing for continued confrontation rather than negotiation. Moscow has argued that these countries are acting against their own interests by prolonging a conflict that has damaged European economies and security. Zakharova said Russia is urging the United States to push back against European interference. She said, "In our dialogue with the American administration, we constantly call on our colleagues to actively counter this destructive process." The framing is notable. Russia is positioning itself and the United States as potential partners in diplomacy, with European governments as the obstacle. This approach may reflect Moscow's assessment that the Trump administration is more skeptical of European allies and more open to bilateral deals that bypass traditional alliance structures. The simultaneous developments in the Caribbean and in Ukraine negotiations highlight the complex and contradictory state of U.S.-Russia relations. On one hand, the two countries are engaged in what Russia describes as productive negotiations over Ukraine, talks that could potentially lead to a settlement of the most significant conflict in Europe since World War II. On the other hand, they are on opposing sides of an escalating confrontation in the Caribbean, where Russia is backing Venezuela against what it calls American piracy. Whether these two tracks can coexist or whether tensions in one area will spill over into the other remains to be seen. The juxtaposition of these two issues, Caribbean confrontation and Ukraine diplomacy, reveals the complicated nature of great power relations in the current era. Unlike the Cold War, when the U.S. and Soviet Union were adversaries across virtually every domain, today's U.S.-Russia relationship is characterized by selective engagement. The two countries can be negotiating partners on one issue while being fierce opponents on another. Whether this compartmentalized approach can be sustained as tensions rise in the Caribbean remains an open question. Throughout its statements on Venezuela, Moscow has presented itself as a defender of international law against American actions, according to its foreign ministry. By invoking principles of sovereignty, non-interference, and the primacy of the UN Security Council, Russia is appealing to countries around the world that share concerns about U.S. power. This framing serves Russia's broader strategic interests, building coalitions against American dominance and presenting itself as a champion of the global South. Whether other countries will join Russia and China in opposing U.S. actions at the Security Council session will be an important test of this strategy. The crisis also highlights growing tensions in U.S. relations with Latin America more broadly. For decades, the United States has treated the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence, a region where American power was largely unchallenged. But the presence of Russia and China as active players supporting Venezuela suggests that era may be ending. For governments in the region, the situation presents both risks and opportunities, the chance to balance between great powers, but also the danger of being caught in the middle of their rivalries. The immediate focus will be on the UN Security Council session, where Venezuela and its allies will make their case against U.S. actions. But regardless of what happens at the UN, the underlying standoff is likely to continue. The U.S. shows no sign of ending its interdiction or its strikes on suspected drug trafficking boats. Venezuela and its allies show no sign of backing down from their condemnation of American piracy. And Russia has made clear that it will continue to support Caracas, adding another dimension to an already complex and dangerous situation in the Caribbean.